Barron Trump disguises himself as a broke customer at a bank. What the manager does is unreal. The bank lobby hummed with the low murmur of conversation, the occasional tapping of heels against the polished marble floor, and the rhythmic beeping of the ATM machines. Sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows, illuminating the gold-accented counters and the pristine, modern furniture meant to make high-profile clients feel at home. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee from the complimentary lounge, reserved for premium customers, of course. Barron adjusted the strap of his worn-out backpack, his fingers brushing against the frayed edges of the fabric. His hoodie, slightly oversized, sagged around his shoulders, and the beanie on his head covered most of his blonde hair. He had chosen to look as unremarkable as possible, just another young man trying to open a bank account. He moved through the space slowly, feeling the weight of unspoken judgments settle onto his shoulders like an invisible fog. He felt the eyes on him before he even reached the front desk. A security guard, positioned near the entrance, shifted his stance, his gaze subtly tracking Barron's every movement. A few well-dressed customers threw fleeting glances in his direction before returning to their conversations. It wasn't an outright hostility. No, this was something quieter, something ingrained. A silent but clear assumption: you don't belong here. Barron reached the reception counter, where a woman in a neatly pressed suit sat behind a computer screen. Her name tag read Caroline, and she smiled at him, polite, but forced. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I help you?" "I'd like to open an account," Barron said, keeping his voice calm and steady. Caroline's smile tightened ever so slightly. "Of course. Do you have an appointment?" "No, I was hoping to do a walk-in." She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. It was small, barely noticeable, but Barron caught it. "We usually recommend scheduling an appointment for new accounts," she said, her tone maintaining the practiced warmth of customer service. "However, let me check with one of our account managers." She turned away, muttering something into her headset, stealing another glance at Barron from the corner of her eye. He folded his arms, feeling the creeping sensation of being evaluated. A few moments later, a man in a sharply tailored navy blue suit approached. His watch gleamed under the artificial lighting, and the slickness of his dark hair gave away the kind of effort put into maintaining a polished appearance. His name tag read Ethan Reynolds, Senior Account Manager. "Good afternoon," Ethan greeted with an easy smile, though his eyes flickered with something else. Disinterest? Amusement? Barron couldn't quite place it. "I understand you're looking to open an account." Barron nodded. "Yeah. I just moved to the area and need a place to set up my finances." Ethan clasped his hands in front of him, his smile unwavering but his posture unmistakably condescending. "Of course. We'd be happy to help. We do have a minimum deposit requirement for certain accounts. May I ask how much you're looking to deposit today?" Barron reached into his backpack, pulling out a neatly folded envelope. $500 to start, he said simply. The shift in Ethan's demeanor was instant. The polite smile faltered, replaced by a subtle but undeniable look of dismissal. He took a slow breath, as if recalibrating his response. "I see," he said, his tone suddenly cooler. "We do offer basic checking accounts, though most of our clientele prefer our premium services." "That's fine," Barron replied, unaffected. "A basic account works." Ethan hesitated again. Barron could see the internal struggle happening in real time, the part of him that wanted to turn away this undesirable customer, battling with the obligation of customer service. Finally, Ethan nodded. "All right, let's get you set up. Follow me." Barron walked beside him as they moved past the sleek private offices, where account managers sipped their coffee while discussing investments with their high-profile clients. Ethan led him to a smaller desk in the corner of the floor, a space noticeably less prestigious than the others. Barron sat down, placing his envelope on the desk. Ethan took his seat across from him, booting up his computer. "All right," Ethan said, "I'll need 2 forms of identification." Barron pulled out his driver's license and another ID. Ethan barely glanced at them before typing something into his screen. "And will you be making direct deposits into this account?" "Yes." Ethan nodded absently, clicking through a few more screens. Then, without looking up, he said, "Have you considered banking somewhere more suited to your needs?" Barron blinked. What do you mean? Ethan sighed, leaning back slightly. I just mean, some of our clients prefer institutions that cater to, let's say, a different financial demographic. Credit unions, for example, tend to be more welcoming for, starting accounts. Barron stared at him, taking in the words carefully. The implication was clear. He wasn't wealthy enough to bank here. A slow smirk threatened to curl the corner of Barron's lips, but he suppressed it. Are you saying I should take my business elsewhere? Oh no, Ethan said quickly, flashing that artificial customer service smile. I'm just trying to make sure you're choosing the best option for your financial needs. Barron folded his hands together, his expression unreadable. And if I wanted to open a high net worth account? He asked casually. Ethan let out a small laugh before he could stop himself. Well, those accounts have a minimum balance requirement of $1 million. Barron nodded slowly. Got it? He let the silence stretch, watching as Ethan checked his watch impatiently. I'll just open a regular account for now, Barron said, deliberately drawing out the moment. Ethan gave a small sigh of relief and continued typing. At that moment, a well-dressed man entered the bank, exuding an air of quiet power. He wore a dark suit, his presence effortlessly commanding attention. Several employees straightened as they noticed him, and a few even exchanged nervous glances. Ethan, however, was too busy dismissing Barron to pay attention. But Barron saw the man the moment he entered, and the man saw Barron. The eye contact was brief but enough. Barron tapped his fingers against the desk, waiting. Ethan finally finished the last few keystrokes, clicking through the approval screen. All right, we'll just need your deposit, and you should be good to go. Barron handed over the envelope, watching as Ethan barely concealed his boredom while counting the bills. Everything looks good, Ethan said, sliding a few documents across the table. Sign here, and your account will be active by the end of the day. Before Barron could reach for the pen, a voice cut through the air. Ethan. The account manager froze, his fingers curling slightly. His head turned toward the voice, his face immediately draining of color. The man in the dark suit now stood just a few feet away, his gaze locked onto Ethan with a stern intensity. Mr. Lancaster, Ethan stammered, straightening in his seat. The regional director of the bank folded his arms, his expression unreadable. Are we treating all our clients with the same level of respect? Ethan's mouth opened slightly before he caught himself. Of course, sir. I was just helping Mr. Lancaster's gaze shifted to Barron. Barron leaned back in his chair, tilting his head slightly. The moment stretched, and the quiet recognition in Lancaster's expression was undeniable. Ethan, oblivious to what was happening, scrambled to smooth over the situation. I was just assisting Mr. Trump with a standard account. He stopped abruptly, because suddenly, everything clicked. The security guard near the entrance stiffened. Caroline at the front desk sucked in a sharp breath. A couple of employees, who had dismissed Barron upon his arrival, exchanged horrified glances. Ethan turned back to Barron, his brain working at 1,000,000 miles per second. Mr. Trump? He echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. Barron finally allowed the smirk to form. Surprise. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as the realization fully settled in. His hands, which had previously been so confident in shuffling paperwork, suddenly felt clammy against the desk. Mr. Lancaster remained silent, his sharp gaze moving from Ethan to Barron, as if evaluating the situation from all angles. The entire bank floor, which had been humming with quiet transactions and muted conversations just moments ago, now felt suffocatingly still. A few feet away, the security guard, who had been subtly watching Barron since the moment he walked in, looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. Ethan's lips parted, but no words came out at first. He tried again. Mr. Trump. Barron tilted his head, amused. You what? The tone was casual, but the weight behind it was immense. I didn't realize, Ethan admitted, his voice suddenly stripped of its arrogance. Barron exhaled slowly, then leaned forward just slightly, resting his elbows on the desk. Didn't realize what? Ethan's fingers twitched. He was trapped, backed into a corner of his own making, and he knew it. I didn't realize who you were, he finally muttered. A small, humorless chuckle escaped Barron's lips. He nodded, almost as if he had expected that answer. Yeah, I figured as much. Lancaster shifted his stance, his voice cutting through the thick tension like a blade. Ethan, why don't you explain what happened here? Ethan's gaze darted around, as if looking for an escape route that didn't exist. I was just assisting Mr. Trump with an account, he said quickly, too quickly, as if speed could erase the last 20 minutes of interaction. We were just going through the normal procedures. The normal procedures, Lancaster repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the words. Yes, sir. Barron observed the exchange, fascinated by the way Ethan's voice lacked the confidence it had just moments ago. It was amazing, really, the power of a single name. Funny, Barron mused, leaning back again. Because I seem to remember you suggesting I take my business elsewhere. That this bank wasn't the right fit for me. Ethan flinched. His mouth opened, but Lancaster raised a hand, stopping him. That true? Lancaster asked, his voice smooth but undeniably sharp. Ethan's face turned a shade paler. I may have. I'd like a direct answer. Ethan licked his lips. Yes, sir. The quiet that followed was deafening. From the side, a woman gasped softly. The security guard visibly clenched his jaw, as if bracing for impact. Barron tapped his fingers against the desk, his expression unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he let out a short breath and stood up slowly. Well, he said, adjusting the strap of his backpack, I guess it's good that I found out early. Ethan hesitated. Mr. Trump, But Barron was already turning away. Lancaster, however, was not done. Ethan, I'd like to have a word with you. In private. Ethan paled further. Barron didn't stay to listen. He had already heard enough. As he walked toward the exit, the whispers started, hushed but frantic. A few of the bank's higher-level employees exchanged panicked glances, their brains clearly working overtime to process what just happened. Caroline, the receptionist, looked horrified, her entire demeanor now drenched in regret. Before Barron could reach the door, a voice, a different voice, desperate this time, called out behind him. Mr. Trump. Turned. It was Ethan. The account manager had abandoned all pretense of confidence. He looked shaken, his once pristine posture now slightly hunched. Please, Ethan said, voice raw. Let me explain. Barron studied him, his gaze cool and measured. What's there to explain, he asked. Ethan's hands twitched, as if itching to fix what had already been broken. I made a mistake, he admitted, exhaling shakily. A serious one. Barron raised an eyebrow. Go on. Ethan swallowed. I shouldn't have judged you. He hesitated. That was wrong of me. Barron remained silent, waiting. I should have treated you with respect, Ethan continued, his voice lowering. Not because of your last name, but because that's how every customer should be treated. Something flickered in Ethan's expression, something that resembled actual remorse. I was wrong, Ethan said again, this time with more conviction. Barron considered him for a long moment. The bank was still eerily silent, every single person watching with bated breath. Then, finally, Barron nodded once. Yeah, he said. You were. Ethan flinched but nodded. I want to make it right. Barron tilted his head. How? Ethan faltered. It was clear he hadn't thought that far ahead. Barron exhaled through his nose. Then, in a tone both calm and deliberate, he said, How do you make up for a first impression like that? Ethan had no answer. Barron let the moment hang in the air, then turned fully toward Lancaster. You should probably check how many other customers have been turned away like that, he said simply. I have a feeling I wasn't the first. Lancaster nodded grimly, his lips pressing into a thin line. We'll be having an internal review. Barron nodded, then glanced back at Ethan, who still looked like he was grappling with the weight of his own actions. With nothing else to say, Barron turned and left the bank, his steps light, as if he had never been burdened by the weight of their judgment to begin with. Outside, the city hummed around him, oblivious to the small storm that had just passed within the bank's walls. He took a deep breath, feeling the warm air fill his lungs. Then, pulling out his phone, he made a call. Yeah, Barron said into the receiver, his voice steady. I'd like to buy a bank. Barron strolled down the busy sidewalk, the weight of the encounter still sitting in the back of his mind, but not heavy enough to burden him. Instead, it amused him. The sheer panic on Ethan's face, the way the entire atmosphere in the bank had shifted the moment they realized who he was, it was almost too predictable. But more than that, it was disappointing. How many times had that same account manager dismissed people without a second thought? How many customers had walked into that bank only to be judged before they even had the chance to prove themselves? He had only caught them because of his name. How many had left humiliated, with no way to prove their worth? He tightened his grip around his phone as he reached his car. "Sir," the voice on the other end finally said, responding to his earlier statement. "Did you say you'd like to buy a bank?" "I did," Barron confirmed, unlocking his car door. There was a pause, followed by a hesitant cough. Mr. Trump, I assume you mean investing in a financial institution, correct? Because purchasing an entire bank." "I mean exactly what I said," Barron interrupted smoothly. The banker on the other end made a small noise of understanding, but there was still a layer of uncertainty in his tone. "Well, I can certainly make some calls, but acquiring a whole bank is not exactly a small task." Barron slid into the driver's seat, starting the engine with a lazy flick of his wrist. "That's fine," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Just find me something. I don't care how long it takes." The pause. "Understood, sir. I'll begin making inquiries immediately." Barron smirked, satisfied, before ending the call. He leaned back against the headrest for a moment, exhaling. Would he actually buy that specific bank? Probably not. But that wasn't the point. The point was simple. People like Ethan should never be comfortable thinking they could judge someone's worth by their appearance. And Barron had every intention of making sure that message was received. 3 weeks later, Ethan Reynolds had spent the last 3 weeks in a state of barely contained anxiety. Ever since that day, the day he made the biggest mistake of his career, his life had been a nightmare. It had started small at first. The whispers from his coworkers. The way his boss now kept him under constant scrutiny. The bank's HR department had been conducting a full review of customer treatment policies, and suddenly Ethan was not so confident in his future at the company. But the worst part? It was the waiting. Waiting to see if Barron Trump was the kind of person who let things go, or if he was the type to come back swinging. Unfortunately for Ethan, today he was about to get his answer. The morning started normally, or at least as normal as it could be when you were constantly looking over your shoulder. He had just finished setting up his workstation when he noticed something odd. People were whispering again. But this time, it wasn't just about him. Something was happening. He followed the direction of his coworker's stares, turning toward the glass entrance doors of the bank. And his stomach dropped. Because walking through those doors, looking completely at ease, was Barron Trump. Ethan went still. No. Why was he here? What was he doing back? The other employees had clearly recognized him this time. They weren't dismissing him like before. In fact, a few of the tellers straightened in their seats, clearly trying to look more professional, as if that would somehow erase what had happened weeks ago. And behind Barron, trailing just a few steps away, was Mr. Lancaster. The regional director looked calm, but Ethan had worked under him long enough to see the tension in his posture. This wasn't just a casual visit. Something was about to happen. Barron walked up to the main counter, placing his hands on the surface lightly, tapping his fingers against the cool marble. The receptionist, Caroline, who had been equally complicit in dismissing him weeks ago, offered a nervous but overly bright smile. Hello, Mr. Trump. Welcome back. What can we do for you today?" The way she said his name, so overly enthusiastic, made Barron's smirk deepen. Funny how things changed when people knew who you were. "I'm actually here for an announcement," he said smoothly, his tone casual, but layered with something just beneath the surface. "An announcement?" she repeated, her smile faltering. Barron turned slightly, looking toward Lancaster. "Do you want to tell them, or should I?" Lancaster cleared his throat, stepping forward. He looked directly at Ethan. "As of this morning," he said, his voice professional but firm, "this branch will be undergoing a major restructuring. And unfortunately, some staffing adjustments will need to be made. Ethan's blood turned ice cold. He barely heard the rest of the words coming out of Lancaster's mouth because suddenly his entire world was tilting. This was it. This was retribution. This was the consequence he had been dreading since that day. And due to certain behavioral concerns, Lancaster continued, still watching him closely, there are individuals whose positions will be terminated effective immediately. Ethan felt all the air leave his lungs. People were staring at him now, and he knew. He just knew. Then, finally, Barron spoke again. His tone wasn't cruel. It wasn't even angry. It was just factual. You never know who's walking through that door, Barron mused, tilting his head slightly. You never know if the guy you're trying to dismiss is just some broke kid, or the person who might have the power to change your entire career. Ethan couldn't breathe. Barron exhaled, then turned toward the rest of the staff, clapping his hands lightly together. Moving forward, this bank will have a new policy, he said, smiling a little. You treat everyone with respect. No exceptions. And with that, he turned, strolling right back out the way he came. Ethan stood there, motionless, as the weight of what had just happened settled over him. He had been judged. He had been found wanting. And now he was paying the price. As the heavy glass doors swung closed behind Barron, the bank felt quieter than ever before. And for Ethan, that silence was the loudest thing he had ever heard. The world around him buzzed in slow motion, a dull hum that barely registered in his brain. The other employees exchanged nervous glances, some whispering, some pretending not to notice, but they all knew. They knew he was done. His fingers curled into fists on his lap. His body felt cold, despite the artificial warmth of the bank's air conditioning. This wasn't just a bad day. This was the end. He had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, perfecting his sharp suit, his condescending tone, his air of superiority. He had convinced himself that he belonged at the top, that he could look down on people like Barron, people he assumed were nobodies. And now, Barron Trump had just walked in and shattered everything. His mind scrambled for solutions, some way to fix this, to talk his way out of it, but every idea that surfaced was immediately crushed by the weight of reality. He had already lost before he even had a chance to fight. Mr. Lancaster's voice rang in his ears, sharp and final. Certain behavioral concerns. The words replayed over and over like a death sentence. Ethan sucked in a shaky breath and forced himself to stand. His legs felt like lead, heavy and unwilling, as if they too understood the gravity of what had just happened. His co-workers watched, some with pity, others with concealed satisfaction. He had made plenty of enemies over the years, people who had suffered under his arrogance. None of them spoke as he gathered his things. No one stopped him. Not even Caroline, who had been his closest work ally. She merely lowered her gaze, as if avoiding eye contact would erase the fact that she had once laughed alongside him, complicit in dismissing customers they deemed unworthy. Ethan's hands trembled as he stuffed documents into his briefcase, ones that no longer mattered. His watch, once a symbol of his status, suddenly felt cheap and meaningless on his wrist. As he approached the elevator, Mr. Lancaster's voice stopped him. You should have treated him like everyone else. Ethan froze. He didn't turn around. He didn't have to. Because he already knew what he'd see, disappointment, maybe even disgust. The doors slid open, and Ethan stepped inside. The last thing he saw before the doors closed was the place he had once ruled, now nothing more than a reminder of what he had lost. 2 days later, Barron Trump stood in the office of his newly acquired bank, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. The morning sunlight poured through the massive windows, casting a golden glow over the polished wood desk in front of him. He had just finished reviewing the latest reports from the restructuring team. His father had been skeptical when Barron first told him about buying into the financial industry, but after seeing the way his son had handled this particular situation, even Donald had to admit he was impressed. Barron set his coffee down and stretched, the weight of satisfaction settling into his chest. This wasn't just about Ethan. It was about proving a point. He hadn't bought the bank just to fire one arrogant manager. No, that would have been too easy. He had bought the bank because he wanted to change something bigger. For years, institutions like these had catered to the elite while turning their backs on people who actually needed financial opportunities. And Now that would change. A soft knock at his office door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in." The door swung open, and Lancaster stepped inside. Unlike before, he no longer carried the same stiff authority. Instead, there was a quiet respect in his movements. "The transition has been smoother than expected," Lancaster reported, setting a file on the desk. "The team is responding well to the new policies." Barron nodded, flipping through the pages. The changes were already in motion: more inclusive financial plans, better customer service training, a stronger emphasis on equal treatment. No more dismissing people based on how they looked. No more turning people away because of assumptions. "This is good," Barron said, closing the file. "And the new hiring process?" "We've already replaced Ethan," Lancaster confirmed. "The new manager is coming in today." Barron smirked. "Good." Lancaster hesitated. Barron noticed. "What?" he asked, arching an eyebrow. Lancaster exhaled, shifting his stance. Ethan reached out to HR. Barron's expression remained unreadable. "And?" "He requested a meeting with you." For a moment, the office was silent. Barron leaned back in his chair, considering. He could already imagine why Ethan wanted to talk. A plea, the second chance. Or maybe, just maybe, something more. "Schedule it," Barron finally said. Lancaster looked mildly surprised but nodded. "Understood." As the door closed behind him, Barron exhaled slowly. Would Ethan come in humble? Would he come in angry? Or would he come in having learned something? Barron supposed he'd find out soon enough. That afternoon, Ethan sat in the waiting area of the bank, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He had barely slept in the last 2 days, turning over every possible scenario in his head. He knew he had messed up. He knew there was no way to undo the past. But still, he was here. And that had to count for something. A woman in a dark blazer approached him. "Mr. Reynolds?" He stood immediately. "Yes?" "Mr. Trump will see you now." Ethan swallowed and followed her down the hall, his heart pounding harder with every step. When they reached the large office, she opened the door for him. And there, behind the desk, was Barron Trump. Casual, relaxed, completely in control. Ethan stepped forward cautiously, feeling like a student called into the principal's office. Barron motioned toward the chair across from him. "Sit." Ethan obeyed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Barron folded his hands together. "So," he said, his tone unreadable. "What do you want?" Ethan forced himself not to squirm. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice more subdued than it had ever been. Barron tilted his head. "You already did that." Ethan swallowed. "I know. But I didn't really. I mean, I didn't fully understand until it was too late." Barron watched him carefully. "And now?" Ethan exhaled, gripping the armrests of his chair. "Now," he said, "I just want a chance to prove I've changed." Barron let the words settle before responding. "And why should I believe you?" Ethan hesitated. "Because you don't have to. Because I wouldn't believe me either." Instead, he said, "Because I know what it feels like to be judged unfairly now. And I never want to make someone else feel that way again." Silence. For the first time, Ethan wasn't trying to sell something. He wasn't trying to save himself. He was just being honest. Barron tapped his fingers against the desk, thinking. Then finally, "I won't give you your old job back." Ethan nodded. "I won't put you in charge of people again. At least, not right away." Another nod. "But if you really want to prove yourself," Barron said, leaning forward slightly, "I'll give you a lower-level position. One where you actually work with customers. Face to face. And if you screw up even once, you're gone." Ethan felt something shift inside him. He had expected rejection. He hadn't expected a second chance. "I'll take it," he said immediately. Barron nodded once. "Good." Ethan exhaled, a mix of relief and disbelief washing over him. He had been knocked down, but now he had the chance to get back up. And this time, he wouldn't waste it.